Today is the 7th of January, 2018, a project with the Armed Forces Heritage Museum and with the Boy Scouts. This is Eagle Scout project, Peter Higley, and he is interviewing World War II veteran Archie Fagan.
Thank you very much.
All right, so let's begin by talking a little bit about your family. So where and when were you born?
I was born in Philadelphia, February the 8th, 1927.
What about your parents?
They were Jewish immigrants that migrated to this country in 1898 as children to escape the tyranny of Tsarist Russia, and they ran a small retail store in Philadelphia.
And what about your siblings?
I am one of 8 siblings. I was number 6.
And what was it like growing up during the Depression?
Well, that was very painful. Prohibition was still in force. People were in bread lines. You had 25% unemployment, and the government was trying to set up programs to feed the poor and the homeless. My mother and father couldn't take care of me because number 7 child, and so they farmed me out to my mother's parents, who raised me during that time, during the Depression.
And what sort of role did religion play in your...
Well, I was brought up with a Jewish education, not formal, but a home for which we were taught dietary laws, good deeds, and also charity, yes.
And did you have a job growing up?
I delivered orders for my mother's and father's grocery store. I had a little wagon. I remember delivering orders to the speakeasies then, which was, Prohibition was still in force in 1932. I worked as a teenager in the drugstore for 25 cents an hour. Yes, I was always had a job and work.
And do you remember any sort of discussion around the house or around the dinner table regarding the situation in Europe?
My father was an avid reader. He read the Jewish papers, the Forward at that time, and they did recount much of the anti-Semitism that was going on under Hitler's regime after he took over in 1932 as he became chancellor. There were reports of coming through, but it was not emphasized by the American press or media. We had to learn it through the newspapers, the Jewish newspapers.
And do you remember the attack on Pearl Harbor?
Very vividly, yes. I was in my early teens. It was Sunday, December the 7th, 1941. The Japanese committed that day of infamy in which they almost completely destroyed the American fleet. And we knew that we were going to war.
After the president declared war on Japan and Hitler's Germany declared war on the United States, how did your life change?
Well, it changed dramatically. We went on a full wartime basis. We were told to conserve. We were issued later on ration books to buy food. And my brother was drafted when he became what his number was called up.
And you graduated from high school in 1944. So
Yes.
how soon after that were you drafted?
About a month after I graduated, I received a letter from Franklin Delano Roosevelt. It said that greetings, report for induction to your local draft board. You're now completely drafted. I was thrown into to defend, to support the Constitution, and I was queried whether they wanted what branch I wanted to go into. I said I would love to go into the Navy, but they told me, soldier, you're in the Army now. We were put on trains and sent to Camp Wheeler, Georgia in late June of 1944, where I took 16 weeks of basic training. We came from young boys in civilian life as children, and we were turned into men in 16 weeks. We marched in all kinds of weather. We went under fire, under barbed wire. We were giving intense training for the war.
And where did you go after Camp Wheeler?
I was given a 7 days furlough before I had to report to Camp Pickett, Virginia for overseas duty, where we went over in convoy. Took us 7 days to sub-infested waters to get to Le Havre, France. We landed in December of 1944. Early invasion was in Normandy. We landed further down the coast at Le Havre, which was a major port, but it was bombed out. And we were given the job of guarding German prisoners that were captured during the invasion 6 months earlier. That was my first introduction of meeting the German Wehrmacht, but they were prisoners then with the POW shirts on them, and we guarded them until we got orders to move up to the front. Several days, or maybe a week after we landed, we were put on French trains that took us to Paris. From Paris, we were fed by the French, and then we debarked, and we had to march 24 hours just for short breaks up to the Belgian border.
And what do you remember about the city of Paris?
Very little. We didn't see. Paris was under blackout. It was the major city that the Germans had taken over and captured. It was a captured city, had lost all its city of lights. We only been fed at the range train station there by French women that they didn't look at us as liberators. They looked at us as late to the game. They looked like they were bedraggled and abused, but they fed us from the canteens there so that we would have food to march up to the Belgian border.
What was the morale on this march from Paris to Belgium?
We young soldiers of 17, we didn't know what would lay ahead of us. We didn't feel fear, we just felt anxiety, and we felt the harsh orders of our superiors that prepare ourselves, but we were given warm clothing, we were given underwear and overcoats and mufflers and gloves so that we would be prepared for the harsh winter that arrived us at the front.
And once you reached Belgium, what happened?
Since I spoke Yiddish fluently, and Jewish Yiddish is a combination of Hebrew and German, I was transferred over to G2, which was Army Intelligence, and I was given the job of interrogating young German prisoners that I would try to get information from them. And we were given cigarettes, candy to give to them to bribe them to get information, and it worked. We found that kindness and mercy sometimes gets more than harshness, that you get more with honey than you get with vinegar. It gave us the information to turn the Germans back, who were not only running out of ammunition, but were so spread out that they had to pull back because reinforcements, we were coming up with reinforcements to drive them back.
And what was it like interrogating these prisoners? What were their mental condition?
Well, they were as afraid as we were. Many of them were part of the Jungen, the German Jungen youth movement, and they were captured and they were hungry and cold just like we were. And they were afraid. They saw the goodies that we gave them, and they were willing to give us information because they were tired of the war as we were getting ready for the war to drive them back.
And what sort of information were you trying to get at?
Well, we got information that they were running out of food and fuel, that they were spread out, that they lacked communication with their superiors. And the Germans had one disadvantage that we found out later, that any strategy they used, they had to get from Berlin. from their high command, the OKW as they called it. They waited for Hitler to give them the information and the orders, where our army was more decentralized, in which we gave the impetus and the motivation to our local commanders. That's why we succeeded at Bastogne at the Battle of in the Ardennes Forest. Yes.
And what was your role in the Bastogne situation?
Well, I first was a interrogator, but once we started to push them back, and the 4th Armored Division, which I was assigned to, the 66th Tank Battalion, was the first to enter Bastogne and relieve the siege there of the 101st Airborne that was in terribly bad shape. I remember them. They had suffered from trench foot, from sickness, from lack of food, and they were glad to see us, but they did give us the welcome that we deserved, relieving them and saving them. They're a very tough gang, that 101st Airborne. They're a tough gang, and there was a certain amount of competitiveness, but if history records it, and as eyewitness, as a witness there, we saved those guys.
Nazi Germany's military force was divided between the regular army, or the Wehrmacht,
Yep.
and the SS. And the SS army played a large role in the German breakthrough during the winter of 1944.
Mm-hmm.
So tell us about the SS massacre at Malmedy.
Yes. Well, if I can recall, the Germans, in their breakthrough, Hitler had used his best divisions, and most of his best divisions were the SS. They had the SS on their collars, SS on their helmets. Hitler had used his real crack troops to break through, because it's his last attempt to divide the Americans from the British to get to the port of Antwerp, which was our major port of supplies. He had a major general by the name of Dietrich, and he was in charge of the leading tanks, and he had also a couple of lieutenants. These were SS men, were part of his crack troops that were the initial men that broke through. He also had used German soldiers who spoke fluent English to deceive the Americans there, to turn some of the signs around, and to kill some of our troops. They used every conceivable weapon to gain access to the Meuse River and to Antwerp, but they failed, because as they ran out of gas and as we came up with further reinforcements, actually we were told the generals were truly worried. Patton was forced to send us up overnight without any rest up to the front to push the SS back. The SS are the cruelest of the German troops. We learned in the war that as the Wehrmacht went forward, in later wars in Russia and in France, they were followed by the SS killing squads, the Earthbox killers. And they would kill all the partisans and the Jews that they found as they followed the Wehrmacht. But in the Battle of the Bulge, the SS was up front to make the determining breakthrough, which they failed because of the resilience and the courage and the fighting spirit of the American fighting man.
And what happened to U.S. prisoners taken by the SS?
The Germans who initially broke through captured a number of American prisoners, maybe 5,000 to 10,000, yes, and had to surrender because they were surrounded. But they put up a fight, many were killed, and so they were captured and hounded and taken over to Malmedy, which was near Bastogne and Saint-Vith in the Ardennes. And ladies and gentlemen, there's where a tragedy and a horror and the articles of war were not observed. The Germans turned their machine guns on our captured Americans and slaughtered them. Yes. So when the news trickled down to us who were still fighting in the field, we were told, gentlemen, if you're Jewish, because our dog tag said H on there, throw them away if captured. We were given orders to take no prisoners. That's what the result of Malmedy. It is to be remembered this day that our men who had to give up were slaughtered because they couldn't defend themselves. After Roosevelt died, our president, our revered president, he died of a stroke in April the 12th, as I remember, in 1945. Harry Truman, the vice president, ascended to the presidency, and he conferred with Churchill, who was the British prime minister, and Joseph Stalin, who was the Russian counterpart there, that the Russians needed revenge. And the deal was made at Yalta, where they met on the Black Sea, that we Americans were not to go into Berlin, we were to leave it to the Russians, because, ladies and gentlemen, in the truth, the facts show that the Russians, of the Allies and the participants in the war, lost the most people, both military and civilian, of around 50 million, yes. So they needed to get into Berlin to show Hitler what the Russians were going to do. And so we were ordered to go southeast.
Do you recall crossing the Rhine and entering Germany?
We had to march up. We found out that the Germans made a terrible mistake by not blowing up the bridge at Remagen over the Rhine River, which was Bastogne the Ardennes was near, and that's where we crossed the Rhine River at Remagen. We were proceeding. The Germans were falling back.
And what was the significance of crossing the Remagen?
That was a morale booster. In fact, the news got back that George Patton, who was head of the 4th Armored Division, he wanted to show his victory and his ego, that he urinated into the Rhine River as we crossed it at Remagen.
And describe what the German countryside and the towns looked like.
If you go to Germany today, you'll never visualize the destruction that we saw 73 years ago. Our bombers and the British liberate Lancasters, they pulverized Germany to smithereens.
And at this point, were the Germans still putting up a fight in the war?
Yes. The Germans were defending their motherland. Don't forget, the Germans were falling back, but they did have the Siegfried Line. They did have the Rhine River that they used as defense barriers. News came back that they were asking for an armistice or some terms for surrender. But under the Yalta Agreement between Roosevelt and Truman and Churchill and Stalin, that there was nothing short of unconditional surrender. And when the Germans realized that mass divisions were surrendering as we were going further east into German heartland, they surrendered. Admiral Donitz, who was then commander of the German army because the other generals had fled, he asked for peace. It was around May the 5th of 1945 that the Germans surrendered unconditionally.
What was your experience with Dachau and the German concentration camp?
That was one of my painful, if you would ask me, one of my most painful and tearful experiences of my life. Keep in mind, I was only 17 and a half. 10 miles before we got to Dachau, we smelled a stench. It was, to this day, it's still in my mind. I wake up during the night, my wife wants to know why I have nightmares. I could smell the stench of death at Dachau. When we got there, the German guards had fled or they were beaten to death by men. Some of the inmates were still able to fight, but there were emaciated, living skeletons that were so happy they cried with joy and got down and kissed our feet and our hands. If you can visualize scarecrows in tattered clothes, men that with sunken eyeballs, men with sunken faces, men with protruding bones, with men disease and maggots all over them. That is the picture of Dachau. But we brought up supplies. We were told not to give them too much food because they would die. Their stomachs were already contracted. So we gave them water and medicine to try to keep them alive. But if you can envision decimation, degradation, if you can visualize human inhumanity, indignity, human cruelty, you can visualize Dachau.
And you speak with any of these former inmates?
Yes, I spoke Yiddish, and they showed me the tattoos they had on their wrist. That Hitler wanted to reduce them to cattle because all the cattle were tattooed to identify cattle. I talked to most of them, and I can say most of them were jubilant. Many of them I spoke German or Yiddish to wanted to go to Israel. They did not want to come to America. So that was what I found out. But we stayed a very short time. We had to keep moving. It was not a pretty sight.
And where did you move on from there?
From there on, I had a small group. We were taken by half tracks down to Munich.
What was life like in Munich at this time?
Well, life was pretty good. I lived in a section, I had my own apartment, and I was told later it was near the home of Eva, Hitler's mistress.
Did German civilians work for the Army of Occupation?
George Patton, our head of the 4th Armored Division, became the managing governor of Bavaria. And so he followed the strategy of enlisting even former Nazis to help him to rejuvenate Germany, to get back, because he was terribly afraid of Russian communism that was be taking over Eastern Europe at that time.
Did you take any excursions while in Munich?
I took the trips to German Alps, and I learned how to ski there, treated royally, and later on we took a trip to Berchtesgaden, which was Hitler's eagle's nest, right near the Austrian border. And we were given plenty of food. We were really treated great. So we did take several excursions.
And how did you come upon the opportunity of of witnessing the Nuremberg trials?
And the colonel came to me to ask me if I would like to go up to Nuremberg. The Nuremberg trials were in progress. If I would go as a military observer. I acceded. I said, "Thank you, Colonel. I would like to go." And so we were accepted by the military police. They wore white helmets as visitors as military observers, and we were given quarters and taken over to the Palace of Justice. 2 days I was there in September. We sat up in the gallery with earphones, and the Russian prosecutor, I remember, was talking about the inhumanity and the persecution and the damage that the Nazis had done on his people. And so that was going on, and we had interpreters there. And as I looked down, I could see Göring, Hess, von Ribbentrop, Keitel, Jodl, von Papen, Ernst Kaltenbrunner, the German man who ran Der Stürmer, the German propaganda machine. His name escapes me right now, But these were all, Admiral Donuts was there who capitulated. They were all there. I saw every one of them, and behind each one of them was an American military police guarding them. And this was the array of the German Nazi prisoners that I saw firsthand in September of 1946.
And where did you go after this?
Well, I was there for 2 days, and then we had to go back. And I reported to the colonel in Munich, and that was September of 1946. And he asked me if I wanted to stay longer as with a promotion, and I told him, Colonel, thank you, if I remember clearly, that I wanted to go home, to go to college. I was not born to be a career soldier. And so the ship that took me home was the General Harry Taylor. It was a new Liberty ship. It left the end of December of 1946. It took, the North Atlantic was very turbulent at the time. I remember I was seasick all the way home. But when I saw the Statue of Liberty and the lights of New York, I got down and cried, ladies and gentlemen. You have no idea how beautiful America looks when you've seen the desolation of war for almost 2 years. Ladies and gentlemen, pray for peace, because war is a dirty, evil. It's man's inhumanity to man, and many millions were born after enduring. Pray for peace.
And I would just like to thank you for sharing your story today, and it has been an honor to interview you.
Yes.
And I'd like to thank you for your service as well. So thank you very much.
Pete, can I thank you for having me?
Yes.
And please forgive me if I became melodramatic. Please forgive me. It brings back memories, and I'm a tender, sensitive person. Thank you for having me.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.